Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajim. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. In the name of God Almighty, most gracious and most merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be on you all. As part of ICN Community Dinner Committee, we would like to welcome all of you for virtual community dinner tonight. I know we are all missing the delicious food served at ICN, but Alhamdulillah, during these hard times, we are here to witness another great virtual program. So we are here today to demonstrate our opposition to racism, injustice, and oppression in all its forms. The tragic incident of recent days is a trigger, but the problem has been ongoing for too long. We need to come together and realize that injustice against one is injustice against all. If you don't speak up today, then wait for your turn. ICN condemns racism, injustice, and oppression in all means. We thought a dedicated speaker on this topic will be beneficial for our community to learn more and get educated. Before getting into the actual program, inshallah, I just want to tell you about a quick housekeeping info, and also I want to recognize the committee, the Community Dinner Committee. So we would like to thank our Community Dinner Committee members, Sister Zora, Brother Naeem Mirza, Brother Shahid Qadri, Brother Ahmad Buhari, and one more sister who don't want to share her name. Without all their efforts, this event is not achievable. And our special thanks to our IT team, communication team, and ICN board. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all our efforts. Ameen. So just a quick housekeeping thing. So if you have questions to the guest speaker, please type in the chat comment section. We will consolidate all questions and will be asked at the end. And please remember, a survey will be sent tomorrow morning from ICN admin. Please spend 2 minutes to provide your thoughts and suggestions, which will help us to improve better. With that, inshallah, I request Kashif Fakhruddin, President ICN, to introduce our guest speaker for us.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And thank you, Brother Rahman. Thank you, ICN committee. This committee is very important because when out of the COVID situation, we used to get together and have the dinner, a monthly dinner together with all the community members. So right now, what have been offered to all the community is to have your own dinner, own food, enjoy while this program has been coordinated. So again, thank you for the committee members and leading these programs for tonight. I would like to introduce Brother Abdullah Mitchell. It's our honor that he has taken the time to spend with us with our community. He's a licensed attorney in the state of Illinois. He's a chairperson of Leadership Development Institute, also a board member of Masjid Al-Taqwa, with extensive experience with serving and providing the legal assistance to all the other many Muslim organizations as well. He serves and brings that experience to CIOGC. And that's the Islamic Center of Naperville is a member of the CIOGC organization, and we really benefit from the CIOGC services. So with that being said, the topic today, Brother Abdullah Mitchell will be covering is very important, is one of the initiatives that ICN also wanted to focus on. So today's opportunity is for all of us to learn and get informed, where Brother Abdullah Mitchell will be talking about the recent incident that happened and the Black Lives Movement that started in there. What our community can do, what should be our action items. So some of these that we will learn from Brother Abdullah Mitchell. So without any further delay, welcome Brother Abdullah Mitchell to our program.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Let me begin by offering my thanks to the leadership of Islamic Center of Naperville and to your community for inviting me to speak, particularly on this important topic of systemic racism. When Kashif asked me what would be the topic for tonight, I chose the concept of building resilience. and I prepared a PowerPoint presentation that we will go through to illustrate why I think this is an important, let's say, nexus to the very problem that we're talking about, fighting systemic racism. So, Brother Rahman, if you could put on the initial slide, and we're going to go start that process. As I stated, I think a point for us to begin this conversation is understanding resilience. And as I stated, I chose the topic of building resistance in the African American community. Next slide. When we, if we're going to talk about resilience, it's important to understand what that concept means. It's a term that's misused. Oftentimes, it's a term used to just toughen up, don't complain, and keep going. But the technical definition of it is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. That once it's showing that toughness. Next slide. Well, in the context of the African American community, if we're going to talk about recovering from difficulties, we need to understand what those difficulties are before we can say analyze or understand the African American community's resilience. The next slide. I chose this slide, and I hope this is a private slide, but I chose it for the reason I wanted to demonstrate to you the impact, the trauma that is experienced with the loss of life. Too often, we're bombarded with headlines of the number of people shot or killed on the south side or the west side of Chicago, for that matter, many places across the United States. And it causes us to be somewhat insensitive to the degree of loss that exists. It's almost like, well, it can't be that bad. It happens so often. But these are human beings like everyone else. And to lose someone close is traumatic. The next slide. And it's not just the next slide, please. And it's not like this is just a lot of gang activity. These are everyday people who has a family member that has been lost to the gun violence in their neighborhood. The next slide, please. So one difficulty, as I stated, is this loss of life. The other is inadequate health care as a difficulty. And the slide that I selected, it was kind of personal for me because last weekend, my daughter gave birth, alhamdulillah, to a baby girl. Her name is Aziza. But as a parent, I worried. I worried because I knew of instances where African-American women don't get the same kind of treatment and care when they go into hospitals, particularly at times of childbirth. And as the statistics shows, there's a 3 times greater mortality, rate of mortality for Black women over white women when they going through a procedure, I don't want to say simple, but such as childbirth. So once again, this is a difficulty that African Americans have to deal with when the assumption is there's equal or equivalent health care for everyone. The next slide, please. Another exacerbating circumstance is the level of poverty that exists. Now, we can go into the sociological reasons, but the reality of it is there is a disproportionate number of African Americans that are living in poverty as compared to the nation as a whole. And this particular graphic is just showing it by age demographics, and like it's just showing, you can see the disparity, and probably the most stark is the last group, the 60 plus, where it's twice as many African Americans are seniors are experiencing poverty as opposed to the overall national average. And I think if we reflect for a moment and we looked at the statistics that have come out of city Chicago as a result of the pandemic, once again, we see a disproportionate number of African Americans experiencing infection and, more importantly, death. And some of this can be attributed to the lack of poor health care or the resources to address fighting and combating this disease. The next slide, please. The next item I wanted to focus in, and some may not think this is a trauma or difficulty, but it is. The photo that you're witnessing now is the woman named Amy Cooper. This is the woman in the city of New York who called the police on another African American male who was also bird watching in the area. And because he complained about her not putting her dog on the leash, she called the police and alleged to the police that he was harassing her and threatening her. And the challenge as an African American male is this is a white person, more particularly a white woman. And when you deal in the court of credibility, who's going to be believed? But for the incident being recorded, he might be in jail or be subject to criminal charges. And this is a trauma, because it does inform African Americans how they're going to deal in that public space. The next slide, please. So with that, just as a background introduction to this whole question about what are some particular issues that the African American community is addressing, now I wanted to bring to you, how would you expect resilient people to respond to these traumas? The next slide, please. What I wanted to do is to kind of use an organization that CIOGC is working with to come to Chicago to address issues that we have in our own community in terms of sensitivity, or more importantly, insensitivity to racism. And we discussed it in our recent webinar at CIOGC, whether we're calling it microaggression, but we have certain cultural ways that have been cultural racisms that have been ingrained into our system that some people take for granted, that don't even find it offensive, either, as I say, unknowingly or knowingly being dismissive of it. So what I wanted to do is to kind of take this particular organization. It's called the Muslim ARC. Muslim is the Muslim Anti-Racist Racism Collaborative. What their particular purpose is to bring racial justice as the mission for the organization. The organization is held by a Muslim. Her name is Marguerite Hill. She has a bachelor's degree from Santa Clara University and a master's from Stanford, and for the past 15 years has been working on racial justice and racial justice scholarship. The next slide, please. So when we're talking about resilience and using this as our model, well, what benefit would this organization bring, not only to the African American community, but to the community as a whole? Well, to the extent that we acknowledge that there is a problem, that racism does exist even in these subtle systemic ways. Clearly, a benefit that we all can realize is their expertise in getting us to understand how racial injustice and manifests itself, and more importantly, can lead us in training to help us better understand this as a problem and how we collectively can work to combat systemic racism. Another benefit that I would say is that, and maybe in some ways a restatement of the previous point, but if we're not aware of what the racism, how it exists in the greater community or even within our own community, how can we bring about change? And then the last point is that they have the expertise that they could provide the necessary training so that collectively we could benefit and move forward and help combat systemic racism. The next slide, please. No, go back. Yes. What are the challenges to the Muslim Arc's resiliency? Well, I need you to understand that being committed to racial injustice was really not on the top 10 list of people of institutions to support. Not until we saw an African American male choked to death before our own eyes. So clearly, there is a need for us to become more sensitive and aware of how racism impacts the African American community. The other challenge in terms of their resilience for the Muslim Arc is they're understaffed. If this is not a popular, let's say, social cause at the moment, then they're not going to have the necessary staff that is needed, and relying strictly on too heavily on volunteers. And ultimately, the issues does go back to the question of funding. Do they have the funds necessary to achieve their mission? The next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So it's not merely a question of the Muslim Arc as an organization to toughen it out. They have, and when we're talking about ways that the community, the Muslim community, can help, if we see this as a vehicle to help heal the community, to help combat systemic racism, and if we see this as an organization has the necessary expertise and insight to, one, raise our awareness, and two, provide the necessary training so that we can be more inclusive and more sensitive to the effects of systemic racism, then we all stand to benefit. I threw this up. This is not endorsed by them. This is my presentation to you, because we, as I stated, CIOGC wants to bring them to Chicago to conduct this training. And the challenge that they're facing now is that all of a sudden now, this is the hot topic for however period it's going to last. But they don't have the resources to be able to come out gratis, to provide the necessary training, even to come, the transportation to come, because it wasn't deemed important enough that it received the necessary support. And the other aspect of it is we're looking for, CIOGC is looking for sponsors for an awareness seminar, because we're going to have to, if we're going to address this, and if you accept our assessment that this organization would be excellent to raise our awareness, then we have to raise the necessary funds for them to come. The next slide, please. Now, I want to use that presentation to try to share with you two aspects of what I see of the problem. One aspect of the problem is that, do we really understand systemic racism if we can seem to live our daily lives, and we don't really experience racism. There's no one, there's no overt, not until recently, a lot of overt signs of racist statements or acts. It is easily to become ignored. The reason I wanted to show those photos once again of the families that experience loss through gun violence is that we hear it so much, particularly in Chicago, that we develop a deaf ear and ignore the seriousness, the gravity of the harm, the trauma that these families experience day after day. Unlike when we have a mass shooting in somewhere like in Orlando, Florida, out in California, and then a flood of counselors come in. This is happening, unfortunately, we see in Chicago on an almost daily basis. But there's no flood of counselors coming in to address the trauma. All that, those emotions are pent up, and they're asked to be pent up because they're supposed to be resilient. Resilience is not to tough it out. Resilience, these particular circumstances have nothing to do with resilience. These are needs that families and people, members of the African American community need to be responded. Whether it is the trauma from the loss of life, inadequate health care, another issue that I didn't bring up, because once again, this is a controversy now in the Muslim community about Black Lives Matter. Oh, we can't support Black Lives Matter because it's violent. And I've heard this statement on local and national Muslim organizations concerned that when we look at some of the protesters destroying property, vandalizing stores, that this is what Black Lives Matter means. It is important for you to understand Black Lives Matter is a movement. It's directed at establishing respect of life and dignity of the African American people here in the United States. It has nothing to do with looting a Target store, jumping up and down, or tearing police cars. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. Now, CIOGC right now is developing a platform or program to address systemic racism. And it is a three-pronged approach. First, it is education. And through education, there's 3 stages. The first stage is to raise awareness. And that's why we're looking at an organization like Muslim Arc, another organization, an African-American based organization. It's called the Muslim Wellness Foundation. Some of you have experienced because they have come to Chicago in earlier times. But these are the organizations we're looking to, one, raise our awareness, both in our community itself as well as outside our community, and to develop the sensitivity training. The concern among many African Americans right now, so you understand, is this. Right now, as a result of George Floyd being murdered, the sensitivity to this issue of racism has garnered the glare of public media and the attention, subject matters of talks. But the concern I share with you from an African American's point of view is that once the glare of the media is gone, will that concern remain? One area that we hope to address that concern is through developing, we've used different terminology. Let me use the most recent one, is calling them advocates, allies, ambassadors. What we're looking is, once we find people that are willing to go through the training, and then through this the awareness seminars and the sensitivity training, inshallah, we will identify a number of people that are willing to commit some time to the ongoing process of, one, identifying systemic racism and it exists either on a community level or in our neighborhood or in our state, and work with the African American community and other organizations to develop policies or programs to combat that systemic racism. Because we cannot, and I originally called this, I wanted to label this the eradication of systemic racism. But that was a wishful thought, because the reality, just like our dean, that is a personal choice. If someone's going to be racist, that's a personal choice. But what we can collectively do is make it difficult, set up barriers for anyone to exhibit, display racist behavior. The second, as it's called, bucket or prong of a plan to combat systemic racism is advocacy. And let me address this now once again in terms of the subject matter that is talked about again across many dinner tables, the coffee spots, even if it is virtual. And that's what is called police reform. Some are using terminology as defund the police. As it was shared with me recently, the city of Chicago, of its budget, 40% is directed to the police department or law enforcement. What the approach has to be is not a question about eliminating the police department, but it's changing the culture of how the police department engages with members of the African American community, and for that matter, all communities of color. When you have instances where a person is shot or killed over a alleged counterfeit $20 bill, or shot in the back over possibly being under the influence, these kinds of behaviors cannot be tolerated. They cannot no longer be cloaked under any kind of immunity for the police. This is not how we expect law enforcement to interact with us as members of society. So one area is, how do we engage and become involved, developing policies and proposing it as legislative bills to change the culture of how police behave in the African American community, or as I stated earlier, how they interact in general with communities of color. Another platform or particular issue is the adequacy of health care. Now, when the example I shared in the video, that's really grows in large part out of insensitivity. I can share an anecdotal story about a woman in Atlanta whose life was lost because the medical personnel felt that she just didn't know what she was talking about. She was discharged early and ultimately bled to death. These kinds of things, the statistics shows you this is not just a story. 3 times as many African American women are subject to die at the time of delivery than whites. There's something wrong with that picture. There's something that requires our attention to bring change. The other aspect of it, and once again, this is not a popular subject, but I want to share with you an insight so you understand the problem from this side of the looking glass. Once you have a criminal record, you continue and continue to pay for your crime long after the sentence has been served. In some states, you're disqualified from voting. It's across the United States, it's a factor that will bar you from employment. So in essence, you enter into that, those young men or men enter, and women enter into, it's almost like a vicious cycle. You can't get enough money. You can't get a job. So what happens? You go back to doing the things that got you in jail in the first place. And oftentimes, this whole notion that these are a lot of violent criminals, no, the majority are drug related. Now, no one supports the passage, the commerce in drugs, but the reality is we have to understand the problem and how do we effectuate change? How can we as a community use our knowledge, our resources and talents to do what the government has failed to do, to come up with training programs? Right now, in the United States, we know there's a continuing need in the information technology area. This community of all communities knows the import of that as a means for economic uplift. So these are some of the ways we as a community must begin to explore to change the dynamics and the trajectory of these cycles, these vicious cycles from jail to crime back to jail, because there is no effective living wage that someone can earn once they get a criminal record. And the other area in terms of advocacy still remains is housing. And I know I don't want you all to be looking at this as, well, these are big problems beyond our expertise. My objective in sharing with you is to give you an understanding of the problem. And we can see how we can come together and begin to chip away in finding solutions that will change the trajectory of the inadequacies or inequities that are experienced in the African American community. And that really leads me to the third prong of the platform that CIOGC is suggesting, and that is service programs. Earlier, I mentioned in the statistics, when we looked at the poverty rates and we looked at seniors, where it was twice the level, twice as many African American seniors are in poverty as opposed to whites. And how does that impact? And I used the COVID-19 way to illustrate that. As a result of being in the position that I currently serve, I've had an opportunity to meet with people in the city of Chicago who are directed at this. And I've spoke with the person who is a part of the head of the community outreach for the city of Chicago. And I asked them point blank, what do you see that we as a community can do? Because that's when the call was, let's provide personal protection equipment to first responders. Clearly there's a need. But where he was most concerned were in senior housing on the south side and the west side of Chicago, where people on fixed income, primarily Social Security, living in subsidized housing, still lack the resources to really, they don't have enough money to call the Uber or the Instacart to come and deliver a meal. They have to rely on a family member, if there's a family member. How do they get the personal protection equipment? So what he suggested to me, he says, if your community can make sure deliver masks and personal protection equipment to these institutions, that would help out tremendously. I share that to share with you to understand is that if we look at the total package, it may seem a very difficult problem beyond our capabilities, the most we feel maybe we'll make dua, inshallah, and change will come. But the reality of it is there's little ways that each of us can contribute and chip away at the problem to slowly bring about change in these practices of systemic racism in the United States. So whether we're talking about supporting an organization like Muslim Arc or working through your civic engagement committees or outreach committees and working through other member organizations of CIOGC to work and develop a overall attack or approach to solving some of these problems, all of those should be on the table. All of those should be something you individually and collectively as an organization should be considering. Because this is not a problem that's going to go away with a donations of X number of boxes of food or X delivery of X number of masks for personal protection. This requires a commitment that we want to see change. We want to see racism eliminated. For until one of us, as long as one of us are suffering from discrimination, the reality of it, we all hurt. And if it's not you today, it may be you tomorrow. So my request of you is to engage with us in beginning to fight this particular problem called systemic racism. And this is a little bit out of order, but this is a point I neglected to bring up, but it is in line with my last comments and the concern about the terminology Black Lives Matter. And people say, well, all lives matter. And the analogy I want to share with you is one that was shared by me with a Baptist minister on the south side of Chicago recently. And what he said to me was this: to say all lives matter is like, he drew the analogy to, there's a house and it's the black man's house on fire. And the firemen come to say, let us address this problem of fire. And they say, well, no, don't just work on the black man's house. All our houses matter. What I'm trying to say to you is this: as long as racism is permitted to manifest itself in our society, in the treatment of any people, more particularly at this moment in time, the continuing legacy of this treatment as experienced by African Americans, then the problem will eventually come and touch us all. We must look at this as a problem that we have to eradicate for the betterment of our society, of our community as a whole. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Brother Abdullah Michel. Alhamdulillah, it was a wonderful speech and eye-opening for us. So I'm looking at the chat. So I think we have one comment from Sister Anne saying that commitment and consistency. So probably she's mean to say like we have to be committed on what we are doing, and consistency is very important. That's what she's trying to mention.
Alhamdulillah, I agree wholeheartedly. And that's why if we can approach this from a community level, because it's going to take our success is enhanced when we all work on it together, because people and just in individual sets, we may lose that commitment and that consistency. And that's, once again, one of the reasons we want to have this, sponsor this awareness, because just as now as a result of that videotape of the death of George Floyd, people realize, hey, there's a problem. I want to do something about it. And inshallah, that if we can maintain that awareness and that understanding, we will have the commitment, inshallah, that Sister Garcia was saying was so important.
Inshallah. Just a reminder for everyone else, if you have questions, please post in the comment section. Inshallah, we can ask to Brother Abdullah Michelle. So there is one more question from Sister Maggie Brown. As a 77-year-old white Muslim, what concrete action can I take, I believe? So that is a question maybe.
Well, let me say this in answer to your question, sister. I would ask you to become engaged further with the Civic Engagement Committee at ICN. I would ask that the Civic Engagement Committee of ICN work more closely with the Civic Engagement Committee of CIOGC, because let me say this, and I'm going to put more directly my CIOGC hat on for the moment. I need your members to not look at CIOGC as a separate institution, because as long as we look at that, then it's, well, is CIOGC this or CIOGC is not that? I need you to begin to look at CIOGC as being an extension of ICN. And by that, I mean how your problems that the Muslims face don't end at the borderline of Naperville. They extend beyond that. Solutions require the cooperation more than the Muslims within the city limits of Naperville. It requires all of us to work together. So, inshallah, that is the purpose of one joining in this initiative, because there is not going to be one specific way we can address this particular problem. The key thing, and once again, I would say, is it's important that you begin to commit some real time to the Civic Engagement Committee and the programs that it is proposing. And inshallah, we look for the adoption of this broader program by our member organizations, not for the purpose of saying this is a CIOGC event, but the reality of it is that this is our effort as collectively as a community to combat systemic racism.
Thank you, Brother Abdullah Michelle. I think Sister Maggie asking one more question. What about donating to NAACP? I'm not sure what is that NAACP is.
Okay. Here's what I would say before donating to the NAACP. It's important that you understand what the African-American Muslims in Chicago are doing. Whether it is Masjid Taqwa, with the organization which I'm a member of, and they have community outreach programs, clean up the neighborhood programs, a feeding program, or Masjid Farouk, that's something many of you support in terms of their feeding programs in the community and assistance and shelter for those that lack shelter. But this is where I'm asking you to begin to look to put your money at first, supporting these organizations that are doing it. Because right now, Masjid Taqwa is working towards building a food pantry. Right now, that based on the facilities that we have, it has primarily been a regular lunch program that's been done. But we see the need. There was a food pantry that was right down the street, a block away, but it closed down. So the need is real in the area. I mean, I've been there. I've worked. When you see people appreciative of a sandwich, when we take it so for granted, while we go to the refrigerator and what we want is there, this disparity that exists, inshallah, we cannot continue to ignore. We must begin to address it. And what I'm urging all of us to do it is in this collective way to address these problems. First, through becoming aware of the problem. Second, becoming an advocate for change in those areas that we collectively agree we will support. And then third, collective individual projects to build resilience in the African American community. And let me just answer this a little bit further, because another service project that we're looking at CIOGC, it has been adopted by the House of Representatives, and that's a community nursing program. It is initially, the principals involved are affiliated with the Islamic Foundation North, but the objective is to bring this to the south side and the west sides of Chicago as a way to improve the delivery of healthcare. Probably the best example that we can look to right now is at Imam, Inner City Muslim Action Network. They started out having a clinic in a tent at their annual event, and now they have a federally funded medical facility on the south side of Chicago. The other aspect of it is when we talk about food insecurity is another, once again, we have another example, shining example from Iman, and that's the creation of a green grocer where they work with local vendors, local stoners, community stoners, and convince them that they can still make money, but yet provide nutritious food. These are things that we as a community need to identify and support. And inshallah, that's what we would ask you join in this effort, inshallah, to address these particular problems.
Thank you, Brother Abdullah Michelle. So we have a compliment from Sister Fatima Khan. She says, MashaAllah, great job, Brother Abdullah. Good solutions provided. May Allah make things easy for everyone and bring about systematic change in our society. Ameen.
Ameen. Ameen. Ameen.
And
I see a question here on the screen about what activities or programs can the message arrange to bring in African American communities and make them feel welcome. Well, let me just share you a thought that African American imams shared with me. Why not come to our masjid instead of me having to come to yours? It is, the objective of it is that we it goes back to that program that ISNA was working on, the welcoming masjid. We even have it in terms of this that Muslim does in terms of for the disabled. Is it welcoming? I think that in terms of African Americans feeling welcome in your community, I think it would begin with one, raising your awareness and sensitivity to how actions you may take for granted they may find offensive. So there would be what I would suggest to the leadership at ICN is to support bringing in an organization like Muslim Art to do this sensitivity training that can raise awareness and help clarify everyone your understanding of how we can be, inshallah, more welcoming to all people in our community.
Inshallah. I think the next question is like very important. Maybe is CIOGC working with law enforcement on police reform? That's a wonderful question.
Right now, let me just use Chicago as an example. Chicago, the mayor's formed this task force and to get community leaders. We're not involved at this point in that particular initiative, but there is a recognition by city leaders that or city and municipal government leaders that there has to be some direct engagement and change the way policing is conducted. The concern is that the approach to law enforcement is more combative, more in the form of a army or militaristic approach, as opposed to engaging the community and with the purpose of serving and protecting. Now, how we can begin to engage law enforcement is can also occur on the local level. Last week, I gave a presentation at Islamic Center of Wheaton, and at there, the president, Abraham Anta, shared a conversation he had with the police chief of Wheaton about once they told him they were going to have this outdoor rally, the chief made concern about is there going to be a lot of protesting? Because whether we're talking about law enforcement or the Black Lives movement or this protesting in general, it's the some of the negative connotations that garner our attention, as opposed to the efforts of so many people trying to bring, let's say, constructive dialogue to these problems. So, to the extent that CIOGC, as a representative of the Muslim community, has an opportunity to insert itself in this dialogue, inshallah, we will. I can share with you that CIOGC is a member of the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago, and the leadership of that, and CIOGC, we are a part of that leadership, is engaging the city of Chicago on this topic. So maybe not directly by us, but through an organization who we work with, this is inshallah taking place. But what is very important, particularly to the extent that we need your support, is that we have to have those opportunities for you to begin to share what your concerns are, so that we are sensitive to that as well. This is not a situation where we're saying we're capitulating and say that we don't need law enforcement. Let me share this with you. I began my career as a prosecutor in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I began quite idealistic, feeling that everybody should have a trial by jury, no plea bargains. Well, the mechanism of the criminal justice system changes a lot of attitudes and behaviors. What I can share with you is that there is an element in our society, and every element that is quite ugly. There are bad people, and we do need the police for that. But that does not mean that we cannot have a situation where how police engage with citizens in the community has to be as if everybody is guilty until proven innocent. How do we resort to lethal force when the crime itself would be punishable by probation? We need a change in the culture of how policing occurs in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Abdullah Michel. Very well answered, Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah. So there are few comments. Sister Maggie was asking how to donate to CIOGC. I think, Sister Maggie, it was answered in the chat itself. Please take a look at the chat, inshallah. And
right.
Brother Wahid was asking, are you making similar presentations to other Chicago masjid? I think you answered it. You had some talks in the Islamic Center of Wheaton as well. Maybe if you want to add some more to that, Brother Abdullah Michel.
Well, what I would add is that, inshallah, we will be having a series of webinars commencing next month. We will be sharing that across the network. We would ask that you would join in them because we don't want, I mean, it's more productive if we can do it where it's feasible in a larger setting. We share it in a larger setting so that we can all benefit. Because with so many organizations, if we do it all one by one, it will become a dead issue by the time you get to the end of the line. And as I said, that is the concern. We don't want the glare of once the media leaves, we cannot afford the commitment to leave with it. It must remain if we're going to bring about the change. Because if anything we should have learned from the number of cases that continue to come before us, that this problem is real, it must be addressed.
Thank you, Brother Abdullah. I think
let me make one last pitch for you, and
uh-huh.
that is to ask that I'm asking each member organization to commit to have members of your civic engagement committee join with us as we begin to build out this policy and service projects, because it needs your support. Remember, we're not the CIOGC as an organization is not a member organization. Our strength, our resilience depends on you. If you're there, the more we can do. Inshallah, we will come together to work on this as a community problem.
Inshallah, Brother Abdullah. Together we will inshallah make a huge difference. Inshallah. So
Inshallah.
can I have Brother Shoaib Qadri to make a closing remarks and dua for us?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother Abdullah Mitchell, Jazakallah khair for a truly inspiring and thought-provoking presentation with some clear takeaways for all of us. I wanted to remind myself first and our community that all the rights and liberties that we enjoy today as immigrants can be directly attributed to the struggles and the sacrifices made by the African American community, not only through the civil rights movement, but for hundreds of years before that, and for that their continued sacrifices that they make with the systemic racism until today. So we owe it to them to a great extent, and even the immigration law that came into effect, that all of us and our families benefited from, came directly after the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act that was passed. So we, of course, we owe it a lot to their community, but that's not the reason why we need to act. We need to act because it is our religious obligation, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Nisa, O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or parents and relatives, whether one is rich or poor, Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not personal inclination, lest you not be just. Alhamdulillah, ICN has already been working on many initiatives, and Brother Abdullah Mitchell, let me assure you that we will continue to work with your civic engagement committee. I will take it to the board, and our civic engagement committee will continue to work with your initiatives. There are two current initiatives that I wanted everybody to be aware of. First one, CIOGC has a program where they are offering grants of $1,000 to every masjid that will do a social justice service project. So as you can see on the flyer, ICN is up for the challenge as well, inshallah. But we want the community to send us your ideas. If you have an idea in mind for a social justice project, it could be racial, it could be anything related to racial injustice, economic injustice, doesn't matter. Send us your proposal. Just go to icnmasjid.org/impact, and it's a very short form. Send that to us before June 29th, and then we will compile all these, and then we will submit to CIOGC the ICN project. That's number one. Number two, NILA, the Naperville Interfaith Leaders Association, they have an event coming up this weekend, this Sunday, June 28th at 4:30 p.m. at the Millennial Riverwalk Park in downtown Naperville. It's an interfaith prayer service for racial justice and interfaith solidarity. And Alhamdulillah, Sheikh Rizwan will be there to represent the Muslim community. Let's show our numbers. Inshallah, the weather is going to be nice, inshallah, on Sunday. I'd like, there should be 100 of us at least, out there to show our numbers, to show our solidarity. So inshallah, please plan on that. And I'm just not appealing to those who are attending. I'm appealing to you to encourage your family, your friends to start participating. And once again, Brother Abdullah Mitchell, I wanted to assure you that we will continue to work with CIOGC, ARC, Iman, and other organizations, and we will let the community know through our channels To all my dear brothers and sisters of ICN, please look out for emails, our communication channel, WhatsApp, Facebook, the different channels that we use. Anytime one of these initiatives comes up, please step up and act, because the worst thing that can happen is on the day of judgment, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, there was an opportunity for you to act, stand up against oppression, stand up against injustice. We better have a good answer. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all of us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant justice and equity for our African American brothers and sisters. Make us a means of ending this oppression. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala sayyidina Muhammadin barik wa sallim. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanatan fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina azaban nar wa adkhilna al jannata ma'al abrar ya aziz ya ghaffar ya rabbil alamin. Rabbana la tu'akhizna in nasina wa akhtana. ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين سبحان ربك العزة عما يصفون السلام على المرسلين الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for inviting me. Assalamu alaikum.